Hello, I'm Samuel, and this is Analytical Mysticism. So in Hindu writings, in Muslim writings, in Buddhist writings, in Christian writings, and Jewish writings, they all have the concept of heaven and hell. It's a pretty universal concept, but you don't need to depend on these writings to start seeing these things for yourself. Rather, analytical or mysticism, encourages people to start seeing these things for themselves instead of depending on, outside text to internalize them, right? So the insight of heaven and hell come from the other insight, which I've made a video on, about how consciousness doesn't end after death, and it's taking that to its natural conclusion. If you were to exist forever, right, then where would your psyche naturally go? So take, for example, hell, right? And I'll use an example to instantiate this. So say you have someone who has lost their job, and they're feeling sad about it, depressed, anxious about how they'll maybe put food on the table, if they'll be able to pay their rent, and so they kind of go into a slump, right? And every time they try to apply for a job, right, then the slump kind of stops them from doing that. They start feeling discouraged, and they're like, okay, I'll just do this tomorrow because right now I'm not feeling that well, So this cycle, continues downwards to every time, they try to apply. It's like, I can't, right? And so the anxiety increases because you know that you already should have done it. You're not dumb, right? You know what you need to do. You just can't find the strength to actually do it, So the anxiety increases, your depression increases, like, oh man, why haven't I done this, right? And then after time, the physical conditions of not acting on the need to get a job, right, will, put you in situations like, force you, to like get less food. So like be hungry, maybe your friends, right, think like, oh, this guy's a bum now, or eventually becoming homeless. And that's not where it stops. These are all just physical conditions. It's about how these physical conditions, affect your psyche, So you'll be in that situation, like, maybe start developing a sense of loneliness, which increases your anxiety and pain and depression. And so unless you can break that loop, right, then your psyche will continue going downwards. It will continue into the depths of pain and depression, anxiety, and the rest of them, So if your consciousness does not end, the natural end of that is an infinite amount of depression, anxiety, and pain, And this is not just for, standing off, like, or not standing off, but rather, this is not just, an inability to act, right? Because it also applies for people who do act quite a bit, right? So people who are go-getters, they're always doing stuff, but at the end of the day, but they feel that nothing of what they're doing, ultimately satisfies them. It's like, okay, I've lost my job, I'll get another one, but they're not happy at that either. It's like, okay, I'll start this new project, and they complete it, right? They have the habit of actually doing stuff, right? But none of the things that they do, they find ever bring them happiness, and they find a sense sometimes of being lost, like, what am I doing, right? And these things compound, right? It's not that it's just, a small sense of loss, but it's whatever, So take the example of, someone who brings food into their bedroom before they sleep, They're like, okay, I'll eat this when I wake up, I'll be efficient about it, I'll just like, bam, food, get to work, right? What they might find is that insects start crawling into their food, like ants and the rest of them, and then they have an ant bite, and they're like, oh, that's pretty annoying, but they're like, whatever, right? And they keep doing this for a few months, they start noticing ants getting into the food, and instead of fixing the cause to it, they just throw out and like, hey, look, I'll put 2 cakes. Say they eat cake for breakfast, right? I'll put out 2 cakes, and that way they'll only eat one of them, and I can eat the other one in the morning. And maybe that works for a second, right? But soon, you know, the insects know, hey, there is food here, right? I can go to this place and get more food. So they start swarming the second cake that you put there, right? And if you don't solve the actual problem, right, then you keep putting more and more cakes into the room. Sooner or later, you know, you're gonna find yourself covered in insect bites, you know, making you miserable. You'll always be throwing out food. You'll be hungry in the morning because there's no food left for you to eat, right? So without fixing the source of the problem, then the effects continue to compound. And it's the same with your psyche, you know, that if you don't fix the source of one's misery and anxiety and depression or feeling lost, you know, then those things will compound into eternity, especially given that the soul does not end, or not the soul or the consciousness, the psyche, there's a bunch of different words for it, but that does not simply end at death. And I have made a video about that. And so the flip side works, you know, for heaven as well, which is the ultimate happiness, that you're always, you know, aware of like the source of your displeasures in life and dissatisfaction. You're looking at this scenario, something comes to you and you're like, okay, well, I'll adapt accordingly. You know, and you're in this scenario, something good happens to you and you accept it, right? And so that every situation, no matter what you're in, you know, you don't really feel displeasure because you've developed, you know, the psychological model necessary to live a happy life. And that thing also continues after death because your consciousness does not end at death. So you continue going forward, and you might not, it's all about trajectories and trends. So you might not be fully efficient at the moment, and you might slip and you fail, and it's just like you let certain things bother you that shouldn't bother you. But if your trajectory is upwards and you're slowly getting rid of all your psyche's reasonings for having suffering, then you'll continue to, you know, metaphorically ascend. You know, that if you're on the path of fixing your problems, then sooner or later you'll have fixed most of them, right? And you'll have the like ultimate happiness that no matter what's coming to you, right, whether other people consider it to be good or bad, will actually bring you happiness, you know. And so this state of peace with existence, you know, being ecstatic at everything that comes to you, you know, this is what these writings ultimately refer to when they talk about heaven, right? It's human beings in their most, you know, natural state, as it were, you know, not being stuck in these loops that we get ourselves into, you know. So, if you do want to know more about not necessarily just heaven and hell, but other mystical concepts in how they apply to modern day life, check out my other videos and subscribe to the channel.